Welcome back. COP27 has been extended by 1 day, giving participants more time to try and resolve one of the main sticking points, the financing of loss and damages due to climate change. Earlier, UN Secretary General António Guterres reminded countries at the conference in Sharm El Sheikh in Egypt that the world is watching and waiting for meaningful outcomes.
It's a race against time for negotiations. With only a few hours left before the end of the summit, those who are monitoring the negotiations are still hopeful.
I think African countries should put pressure in these last 48 hours to make sure that the investment flow will go there. I do think now some African countries, I'm thinking in particular on South Africa or Senegal, who has begun bilateral discussion, but that should be broadened and have more access to this, in a way, package of private and public funding to finance the transition to clean energy. And in Africa, it's not on clean energy alone, it's just as well a big amount of increased amount of energy, and in particular the clean one.
Right now we have an opportunity to do better than that. So if on Friday, Saturday, maybe even Sunday, we don't know when this thing will end, we will have to see. We cannot come out of here without, I think the momentum is such that we will have to get an outcome on loss and damage that is not an agenda item only, but that is finance facility based.
The developed countries would want us to transit into green energy without taking into cognizance the material conditions affecting our respective countries. And I think there's been a greater voice that emphasizes the need for developed countries to support developing countries, not just through loans that we see being announced, but through support that is dedicated, because partly the global warming can be attributed to the countries that are developed.
The president of COP27 was frank.
While some of the discussions were constructive and positive, others did not reflect the expected recognition of the need to move collectively to address the gravity and urgency of the climate crisis. The mitigation work program is yet to reach the desired outcome. Adaptation is still held back by procedural matters. Ambitious outcomes on finance have not yet materialized. And on loss and damage, parties are shying away from taking the difficult political decisions. The Secretary General and I discussed at length the current status of matters relating to funding arrangements, responding to loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. I believe that extra efforts need to be exerted by all parties to ensure an agreement on this matter, one that would provide a basis that would allow us to effectively respond to the urgent and legitimate demand for an adequate funding setup for loss and damage at the earliest.
The UN boss is back in Egypt after addressing the G20 meeting in Bali, Indonesia earlier this week, and is making a final push for better outcomes.
We must have agreed solutions in front of us to respond to loss and damage, to close the emissions gap, and to deliver on finance. The climate clock is ticking and trust keeps eroding. The parties at COP27 have a chance to make a difference here and now, and I urge them to act and act quickly.
It is a race against time for negotiators, but many believe that a better text can still be achieved before the end of the summit. Sophie Mukwena, SABC News, Sharm El Sheikh, Egypt.
Desmond D'Sa is the coordinator of the environmental justice organisation South Durban Community Environmental Alliance. He joins us now. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. So perhaps let's just bring it home, particularly for your delegation, what you would be explaining to those who at COP27, why this is important to reach consensus, to make meaningful decisions. So if you were to explain it from your perspective, to make it practical, what are you saying to them about the importance of climate finance and why it matters to vulnerable countries in Africa?
Well, look, we are in an emergency at the present moment in time. And this is very urgent, very important that we do have a settlement at Sharm El Sheikh. But like we're all aware, that the COP in Paris, that we had in Paris and the one we had at Glasgow, we were given a commitment by the biggest polluters in the world that they will deal with the problem, they will provide the necessary resources to the global south and the continent of Africa. But like we've seen, they've deliberated and they have not come up with any solution. Surely that we deserve better, and surely that this should have been urgent, and that before they had left for the G20 summit, that the presidents and the prime ministers of the big polluting companies in the world, including the US and China, should have settled this at Sharm El Sheikh and made Africa and dealt with Africa in a much more reasonable way and provided the necessary resources, which they're fully aware of, because if they signed an agreement, the accord in Glasgow last year, this should have been very easy for them to develop, to ensure that and provide the resources. But they came to Africa, and like they've done before, it's like they passed by. It's passing by. We've seen this happen in Durban in 2011. We've seen this happen in Paris, and now we've seen it happen in Egypt again. Once again, the world leaders who are responsible for all the emissions and the climate crisis that we all see ourselves in have now passed by and have not really fully committed themselves to a fair and just process so that the continent can survive and the poorest of the countries in the world will be able to agitate, but more critically to adapt to the climate crisis that we're experiencing in the world at this present moment in time.
As you say, there seems to be lack of acknowledgement or not enough urgency in understanding this issue of pace and scale. Many of the emerging and developing economies facing immense debts, with interest rates averaging 3 times higher than those of the wealthy countries. And in the last decade, the least developed countries spent an average of 14% of their domestic revenue on interest payments compared to 3.5% in developing countries. And this as the disasters continue. So if you had to make a point for Durban, which continues to see these devastating rains, its aging infrastructure, and the money just simply doesn't seem to be there.
That is the fact, and despite all the promises and the rhetoric that we've heard over the years from the major polluting countries, that hasn't come down. It hasn't filtered down to the ground. It hasn't come into the country at all. And instead, what we hear coming out of Sharm El Sheikh is that the West is trying to hold the African continent hostage by saying, well, we have to go and drill for gas. Let's go and drill more for gas and oil in our oceans, in our land, in our mountains. And I think that is not fair. It's placing the burden on the population of Africa and the population of South Africa, that we must be the people who bear the brunt of all the pollution. And I think it's time that the African country, that South Africa as well, should stand with the rest of the continent firmly against this bullying and this injustice that continues to take place at the UN. I don't think it's fair that our country, that our ministers and our presidents go to Sharm El Sheikh and then side with the northern countries, with the West, in trying to alleviate and continue business as usual, knowing fully well that the climate emergency is affecting the continent as a whole and all its people.
As you say, they need to be held accountable for the loss and damage that we are facing. And there's been a lot of talk about the kind of packages that would be fit for purpose, not only for developing countries, but for the different areas and regions. So if you could just take us through what you're negotiating there in terms of climate finance, the difference, for instance, between green finance and climate finance itself.
Well, what the activists are doing in Sharm El Sheikh is negotiating for a just and fair and reparation. Definitely the northern countries, those that have polluted the most, have a responsibility to the continent, to the global south, to provide the necessary resources, and that should be given. That there should be a given in that way. There should be no interest, there should be no loans given to the country to hold our future ransom for that. I think that it's clear that all the pollution and all the injustices that we have felt for many years is the responsibility of the northern countries. And the evidence is out there, the science is out there that has shown that these countries should be held accountable. And for all of us on the continent, we want to work together. We certainly believe that these northern countries who have created the climate crisis that our children are paying for, where there's inequalities growing like hell in Africa, they must start coming to the party. They must come with the necessary resources so that people see the changes that they require and that they can adapt and strengthen their resolve, so that if the climate comes again, in many ways, in flooding and in droughts and all that, people will be able to survive and cope with all that. But the West cannot get away with what they've been doing all these years. Time to come to the party and ensure that Africa is treated equally like they would treat anyone else in the world.
So let's see what can and has been achieved at all there at COP27. Some of the obstacles I know are, and as generally the case with these summits, the text, something that must be legally binding, that is unambiguously in favor or meets the needs and demands of developing countries. Can you just take us through that?
Well, we certainly believe the text is not accurate and is not correct, and the West, the Americans don't want to sign it, Chinese don't want to sign it, and it's clear that you have to have binding agreements. If you don't have binding agreements, we've seen what has happened over the years. Trump pulled out of the UN processes because he didn't want to hold the US accountable. And I think we need binding texts so that if they attempt, any attempt not to come to not to deliver on the promises that they made, we then have an opportunity to hold them accountable for that. Voluntary agreements has never worked and will never work. We cannot trust what they say because they've made these agreements in the past and it was all voluntary. It hasn't delivered to the continent. The text has to be changed to ensure that these countries can be held accountable and their word is their honor. And if they don't deliver on their word, then the countries of the continent and global south can do something about it to take them to either some courts in the world, whether it's the court in The Hague or the World Court, whatever it is. We believe certainly that even in their own country, they can be held accountable for their far-reaching commitments. And that is the problem for them. We certainly believe the text is correct, and they want to change it and weaken it so that similar to the Kyoto Protocol, which they've done. They got rid of the Kyoto Protocol because that held the kind of polluting companies accountable for all the emissions that impacted upon people. They've got away with it. They've done away with the Kyoto Protocol. And once again, they do not want to be held accountable. The text is correct. If they sign that text, then we know we are much more safer because they'll be forced to reduce the emissions, and they will go below 1.5 degrees. At the moment, the temperature is rising, people are dying, and we cannot allow that to continue.